Hello and welcome to this special look at life in Britain in the Coronation years. The early 1950s were a time of great change and great hope. For many years after World War II, the British public had struggled on through long, drab days of rationing and shortages. It seemed to go on and on. But at last things did begin to get better, and when the young Queen was crowned in June 1953, it felt like the start of a new era. As commerce and industry got back on their feet, pay packets became fatter. New homes were becoming cleaner and easier to run, as things like central heating, washing machines and fridges all began to make the housewife's life easier. Public transport started to return to pre-war levels of reliability, taking people farther afield again for longer breaks. It was time to enjoy family holidays, only faintly overshadowed by worries about the future. Trouble still rumbled on in the Middle East, and the Iron Curtain was well and truly drawn across Europe, while the death of the Russian leader Stalin in 1953 did little to ease the fear of the atom bomb. The children that grew up in the 1950s would soon enjoy a new prosperity, undreamt of during the war years. Meanwhile, the British way of life carried on. Winston Churchill was back as Prime Minister after 6 years of left-wing Labour government. We now had a national health service. The National Coal Board kept our home fires burning, and we travelled on British railways. Gents smoothed their hair with Brill cream, as this scene of an outing on the Thames reminds us, and how we enjoyed our cigarettes. Battersea Power Station was being extended. Finally completed in 1953, it had a working life of just 30 years. Upriver again to Oxford, with Queen's College fronting the famous High Street. Traffic is modest indeed, a very different story from the Oxford of 50 years on. Magdalen Tower, completed in 1501, stands above Magdalen Bridge, with the famous college behind. Another busy English town, Chelmsford, with its railway arch over Duke Street, a town centre landmark. Beyond, the new bus station, headquarters of the nationalised Eastern National Bus Company. It's school sports day, with the chaplain, the nursing sister, staff members and the commander of the cadet force all on parade. Out on the playing fields, the boys in white shirts and dark grey serge shorts do their stuff. At the swimming pool, there's a relay race. The water's bound to be freezing cold and heavily chlorinated. Good Friday in the 1950s was a proper bank holiday, with all the mills and factories closed and most people having the day off. Fagley Woods was a popular leisure spot near Bradford, and if the weather was decent, what nicer than relaxing by Fagley Beck. Today, of course, there are far fewer factories. Shops and supermarkets open nearly every day, and with the church less of an influence, Good Friday has become almost a normal day for many people. These fellows are off on a day's outing, and it's shirts and ties, pullovers and jackets. Leisure wear as we know it today just didn't exist. They're up in the Yorkshire Dales, beside the River Wharfe in Bolton Woods. If you were lucky enough to have a cine camera, clockwork of course, you'd have to take the film out after 2 minutes and turn it round to expose down the other side. Film was expensive and could be difficult to get, so people's clips of things tended to be quite brief. Headgear was still everyday wear for both sexes, and the early 1950s certainly threw up some strange fashions. Day wear for the housewife, the floral print overall, for a woman's housework was never done. More nappies to hang out in that enamel bowl. There's no record of what this young lady was saying, for camcorders, of course, were still some 40 years in the future. And now to London's West End. It's coming up to Christmas time, and little Frances from Haringey is here with her mum to see all the shops and the crowds and the lights. There's a chilly wind blowing, and everyone's well wrapped up with overcoats, gloves and scarves. First call, Woolworths in Oxford Street. Over on the right, vinyl dollies of 5 and 11p each. That's about 30p. But 50 years on, you've got to multiply prices by about 16 to get today's value. That's £4.80. Balloons and streamers make a real festive spirit. The shops used to put up their decorations around the beginning of December, and the Christmas rush was packed into about 3 hectic weeks. Such a contrast to today, when it all starts around the October half-term, and we're faced with 2 solid months of high-pressure seasonal selling. Somebody's on their way to a Christmas concert, and we're on our way to see the highlight of the day, Father Christmas himself. That young man in his long socks, shorts and school cap a size too small looks a bit old for Father Christmas, No harm in trying it on though. But our little princess is truly enchanted. Pull-along animals were a very popular line for years. Remember how huge the stairs in a big store seemed when you were little. Somebody's going to be very tired tonight. In fact, a bit of a lift is needed right now. Some Christmas trappings have changed, but some haven't. Hamleys of Regent Street, probably the most famous toy shop in the world. One popular toy that certainly wouldn't be acceptable today is this gollywog. Of course, there's none of the battery-operated gizmos that every child demands now, and which have often gone on the blink by Boxing Day. This sturdy stuff would be expected to last and last, and often be handed down to younger brothers and sisters if they came along. Dolls here at 23 and sixpence, or £1.18 in decimal. That's £18.80 at today's values. Hornby Dublo trains, favourites for so long, had mixed fortunes later on, with the brand sold to overseas owners. But model trains are making something of a comeback today. Those gollywogs again. How innocent they seemed then. It's getting dark as we reach Selfridges in Oxford Street, and up in the Enchanted Wood there are still more wonders to be seen. This looks a bit like the Magic Roundabout, except that that's still around 15 years in the future. And now, nearly half a century on, little Frances is a midwife in sunny South Africa, with 3 teenage children of her own. From model trains to the real thing, with an express steam engine at London's Camden Shed. The engine is still lettered LMS, London, Midland and Scottish Railway. And on the main line, the overnight sleeper from Scotland passes by towards Euston, slowed by congestion in the morning rush hour. Behind, you can see the old Victorian engine shed, later to become the Roundhouse Chalk Farm, the famous avant-garde theatre. Meanwhile, at King's Cross, this morning departure is pumping clouds of sulphurous smoke into the atmosphere. Steam trains, like coal-burning factories and domestic fires, were one of the causes of London's dreaded smogs, once a regular hazard of wintertime. It was in December 1952 that one of the last of these deadly pea-soupers descended on the capital. Since then, the Clean Air Act has thankfully banished them to history. And now we're looking at life for a family with young children in those early years of the 1950s. This wasn't a very easy time. Some things were still on ration, not least petrol. While on the world stage, the Korean War was rumbling on, with the menace of the atomic bomb always in the background. But what does all this matter when you're 4 years old? The postman's getting the day off to a wonderful start. And there'll be a second delivery later. Looks like it's all for young David today. Now here's one that the postman didn't bring. A personalised registration. This cart will give hours and hours of fun for David and his little sister. Wooden playthings seem so much more solid and satisfying than the plastic of today. The family garden comes up trumps at fruit picking time. There's an enormous crop of pears. Trouble is, they'll all ripen at once, very suddenly, and then, before you can say knife, they've all gone soft, or sleepy, as we used to say. Little Susan's taking her first steps in a world slowly becoming less regulated. Identity cards were abolished in 1952. A strange thought 50 years on, when there's serious talk of introducing them once again. Down along the seafront, nearly all the cars are pre-war models. For years after the war, everything was going for export, and there were dreary waits for most consumer goods on the home market. Everyone's wrapped up warm against that onshore wind. We're in South Essex here, and it was this area that late in January 1953 caught the worst of the terrible floods and gales that wrought havoc along England's east coast. Canvey Island, very near here, was devastated, with many lives lost and hundreds of bungalows and chalets wrecked. Daddy's belted raincoat is of the kind much favoured by detectives in post-war films. Now it may still be early in the year. No leaves on those branches yet, and the plants have an early spring look about them. But it's a dry day, and a good time to get the mower out and check that it's ready for the season ahead. That looks like a Qualcast or a Ransoms model, and it'll be proudly made in England. There's a long greenhouse in the background, which went up during the war when it was absolutely vital that we grew as much food as possible at home. Winter coats apart, it's hard not to notice how drab and unflattering the clothes of the period look, but the family seem happy enough. Now Granny's bringing some more presents. Indoors after tea, and a toddler-sized teddy provides fun for all the family. Teddy actually looks seriously short of fur. He's a much-loved bear who's been handed down a couple of generations or more. No matter, he'll be good for many a rough and tumble yet. Time to quieten down now and enjoy a game of Corinthian Bagatelle. The idea is to get each ball into the highest scoring hole or ring you can. Difficult when Susan will keep taking them out again. Oops-a-daisy! Still plenty of energy left, and somebody may just know the camera's on her, or maybe not. There's a lovely coal fire in that grate, and with no central heating in those days, the family certainly need it. The dolls have a pram of their own. Over the years, prams have gone right out of fashion, replaced by buggies and pushchairs. Before bed, time for something quiet, like building bricks. It'll be past 5 o'clock now, with Children's Hour starting on the home service on the wireless. It's rather sad that modern life and television mean that cosy scenes like this are nowhere near so common these days. The furniture van's at the gate as this family moved to a new address. There'd been a huge boom in house building in the late 1940s, not least to replace property destroyed in the bombing. And even modest houses had quite spacious gardens by today's standards. Time to set off for school, looking very proud with your lunchbox. Nobody's thinking twice about the children walking by themselves. Nowadays they'd all be dropped off by car. At the weekend, there's time for a game of putting on the seafront course. That cold East Anglian wind's blowing again, and it's made the municipal grass parched and dry. Steady! Missed again. Ah well, next hole. At the pavilion, the children fidget and wait. Hurry up, Dad! Now it's time for a bit of a walk around, and peek-a-boo with the camera. Young David's a bit older now, and he's coming home from school on his super new bike. No problems riding on this pavement. It's been tidied up since the family moved in, and the houses now have proper gates. Sister Susan's learning to ride the bike too, but she still needs a steadying hand. It's quite a relief to get back onto a trike. At least that can't fall over. As kids grew up, they needed to be kept out of mischief and off the streets. When you've found out how a tramp lives, try living his life for a week. How's that for a challenge? 2 youth club leaders chew it over. Sounds just the job, and a project for an amateur film. St Stephen's Youth Club in Burnley, Lancashire, was a popular meeting ground for the local youngsters, as were similar clubs throughout the land in the days when the church was a much bigger influence in society. The club members made this film about themselves, doing all the acting and a lot of the directing and producing too. So it's across to the schoolroom, at a very well-behaved pace. Walk, don't run. But at the schoolroom door, there's a huge scramble to get in and bag a seat. Buck up, the vicar's coming. Right, everyone, quiet now. An opening joke from the leader. And a big cheesy grin from the gang. Come on, you're on camera. That's the stuff. Now, we've got something a bit different for you this evening. We're going to find out what it's like to be a tramp, and we're going to film the whole thing as we go along. We're going to need a lot of help with all sorts of things, but the most important thing is to find a couple of lads to be the tramps. It's not as easy as it may sound. There's very soon a couple of likely volunteers. And so, one fine morning, Dennis and his pal set off from home and head for the hills. On his back, Dennis carries a tent in its canvas bag. And in those days, camping gear really weighed something. Real tramps, of course, would have had no such luxury. Time for a bit of a breather here. They've headed north over the hill towards Gisborne in the Ribble Valley. The shadows lengthen as the lads come down into Gisborne, which looks an absolute picture of unspoilt England in a bygone age. The White Bull Hotel belonged to Dutton's, a local brewery. Nothing doing for 2 teenage tramps though. Uphill again now, and we're hungry and thirsty. Is there anything in that milk churn? Nope, empties for the farmer to take in. Wow, I've just about had enough. So the lads set about pitching camp for the night, with their heavy canvas gear and old-fashioned clothing. The youth club leader ran a chemist's shop, so even in those days of shortages, the club usually had a good supply of cinefilm. They made other movies too, and it all helped to occupy and entertain in those days before television and computers ruled the roost. Night all! Now we'll look at the countryside from a different viewpoint. We're down on the farm here, in rural Staffordshire, and horses are still the mainstay for pulling power. The cows come in at milking time, all 2 of them. English farms in the early 50s were still many in number and small in size, most of them mixed. A couple of cows, pigs, some sheep maybe, 3 or 4 fields with a mixture of crops. The children enjoy themselves in front of the camera, the son in his school blazer. Better not get that muddy. The dog is after Bibbs, the black cat. They don't use long crutches like these now. They're considered bad for the shoulder. There's a colour film in the camera to record the arrival of a new Fordson tractor. New or not, they never did want to start at the first swing. That's got it. Now to get the hang of these controls. There was no cab or protection from the weather on 1950s tractors. Farmers were expected to be hardy. At haymaking time, the men still used the old wooden rakes. They really worked the arm and chest muscles. And they gave you a good thirst too. The baler, though, made light work of getting the hay bound and stacked. In fact, it was in the early 50s that machinery was coming onto the farms in a big way, and jobs for farmhands were starting to disappear. There's one of the women folk. Perhaps she gained her training as a land girl in the war. The war years had seen women on farms in big numbers, with so many men away in the forces. Now the men were back, but with farm machinery replacing horses and agribusiness starting to take over, the next generation would have to look elsewhere for a living. And this is one of the farmer's family marrying into the town, so to speak. The happy day was Saturday the 7th of June 1952 at the Congregational Church in Hall Green, South Birmingham. The couple have picked a fine day in early summer. The country in general has come to terms with the sudden death of King George VI 4 months earlier. And now, with 26-year-old Queen Elizabeth on the throne, there's a feeling of expectancy in the air. The bride arrives in a rather sedate black pre-war limousine. And she's not wasting any time walking up the path. The bride's a brown owl too, and her young charges are here to see her off. Amid all the chatter of family and friends, the bride and groom will be starting to think of their honeymoon, which they're having in Jersey. The guests have an excellent reception to look forward to. And later on it could well be Saturday Night at the Pictures for many, very possibly Gary Cooper in High Noon, that year's classic western and one of cinema's all-time greats. After the war, honeymoons and holidays in Britain were of course still the rule for almost everyone. The Lake District had been a particular favourite ever since the early 19th century. Windermere certainly looks at its best on this glorious early summer morning. Motorcoach tours were at the height of their popularity in the 1950s, with roads and coaches vastly improved, but car ownership still the privilege of the better off. Caravans too were becoming very popular. If you could strike a deal with some friendly farmer, you could now park your van by the seaside or in the country, and with roads so much better, travel to and from it at weekends. You could even park your wife there all week. Traditional seaside resorts did brisk business. At Llandudno, singers Redvers Llewellyn and Webster Booth had their names in lights, while at the Grand Hotel, which between the wars boasted 5 stars no less, dinner was 8 shillings, or 40 pence a head. There were even some spare parking places along the front. Open-air swimming pools, or lidos, remained popular, just as they were before the war. These costumes were definitely made for swimming rather than sunbathing. Remember those rubber bathing caps? Girls of all ages wore dresses or skirts at play. This young lady has borrowed her brother's toy yacht, but there's hardly a breath of wind. A length of string to the rescue. Careful you don't fall in. Rather bigger boats were encountered by those who ventured to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland for their holidays. Roads in the Western Highlands were narrow and tortuous, but that gave the holiday a sense of adventure. And so did these little ferries that carried 2 or sometimes 4 cars at a time on a revolving turntable. Steady, does it? On the Clyde estuary, paddle steamers still plied their trade. This local van driver will know the ropes backwards. The crash post-war housing program involved building many thousands of prefabs like these, put up as a short-term stopgap. Meantime, traditional building was pressing ahead with all possible speed. In the wartime blitz, it was our inner cities with their high-density housing that had suffered most, so new low-cost homes were very urgently needed. Under the socialist government of the late 1940s, council housing had top priority, so with planning controls still very sketchy, new estates sprawled unchecked into green fields all over the country. Estates like this, with linked residential blocks, were a far cry from the old inner city terraces. Half a century later, many now have a run-down feel. It was London, of course, that had taken the worst punishment in the Blitz. But now, 8 years after VE Day, rebuilding was complete across large areas. And so, the capital was able to put on a tremendous display for the great event of those post-war years, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II on Tuesday the 2nd of June 1953. The nation's patriotic mood had been well and truly roused just 4 days earlier, with the news of the conquest of Mount Everest by a British-led expedition under Sir John Hunt. The two who reached the summit were of course New Zealander Edmund Hillary and his Nepalese companion Sherpa Tenzing. On Coronation Day, a few lucky people were able to gather in drawing rooms nationwide to watch this first national event to be fully broadcast live on television. With the measured tones of Richard Dimbleby setting the scene, those little black and white screens in great big wooden cabinets brought the spectacle from London into the homes of the Queen's subjects throughout the land. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, steps up for the solemn high point of the ceremony. Now Queen Elizabeth, just 27 years old, bears the full responsibility of her destiny on her young shoulders. The British excel at pageantry, and every stage of the day had been rehearsed and practiced to a T. The magnificent carriages and regalia of state were sheltered in secure secrecy during the war years. After the service, the procession through the streets of London town to Buckingham Palace. The weather of the 2nd of June 1953 was a typical mixture for these islands of showers, prolonged, and sunny intervals, brief, which somehow seemed to set the seal on the wonderful Britishness of the occasion. The Queen now looks relaxed and radiant. Among the visiting heads of Commonwealth, none would be more fondly remembered than Queen Saloti of Tonga, waving and braving the London downpour from her open carriage. On the balcony at Buckingham Palace, the royal family greet the crowds, a fascinating scene from half a century ago. Coronation Day was a public holiday. People had been getting ready for weeks before, stringing up flags and bunting, and laying in stores for street parties. The East End of London really went to town. Not one single car to be seen. There were civic gatherings and junketings everywhere. Even town centres were closed off to normal traffic. By now, the town band will have got to know God Save the Queen backwards. The street races for the children. And a three-legged race for the mums. Ooh, bet that hurt. The historic borough of Abingdon-on-Thames was in Berkshire then, though it's in Oxfordshire now. Abingdon has a long tradition of making the most of ceremonial occasions. It's a true blue area, with money in the town to do things well. The bun throwing has its roots in a ceremonial feeding of the poor of the borough. The official procession heads for the town hall. The mace bearer leads the mayor's party in. It's definitely a day for raincoats and overcoats. Instead of a shower, buns rain down from the town hall roof. Below, there are plenty of eager takers. Another ancient tradition that benefited the poor, amongst others. No doubt the ratepayers of the town would have footed the bill for all this. Look at that giant tin of Coleman's mustard at the ready. Punch and Judy, the traditional puppet show, came to these shores from Italy around 1700. Anyone from Abingdon recognize themselves as a child? It's a real fun day for everyone, with plenty for the local paper to talk about for weeks afterwards. From the Tory Shires to the industrial north now, for a look at the city of Sheffield and its tramways in those far-off 1950s. Zebra crossings were still a newfangled thing. Sheffield is ringed by hills, and the power of electric traction meant that trams had the advantage of making quick getaways at steep spots. One of the reasons why the Sheffield system worked until 1960, one of the last in Britain to go. Glasgow scrapped theirs in 1962, and after that only Blackpool trams survived, as they do to this day. The city of Sheffield, with its great steelworks, took heavy punishment during the German Blitz. Dozens of trams were destroyed, and replacements had to be built while the war was still on. Essential, because the workers had to be got to and from the factories. There weren't even any traffic lights at this major crossroads in the 1950s. Here comes one of Sheffield's most modern trams, a streamliner built as late as 1952. With a Morris Traveller leading the way, an older tramcar makes steady progress up the hill. The little traffic that's about looks almost lost on Sheffield's wide suburban thoroughfares. One of those old-fashioned road signs warns drivers to slow down for a steep hill. At a road junction, the tram goes round the unexpected side of a traffic island. It was conflicts like this and the inflexibility of running on rails that caused Britain's tramway systems to be abandoned as roads grew busier. But here, on reserved track at the roadside, they had the edge over motor traffic, particularly at congested times. Passengers who have got off the tram have to cross from the stop in the middle of the road, something else that couldn't be tolerated today. Sheffield is sometimes called a dirty picture in a golden frame. Up in the hills, on the fringes of the city, we're in that frame. But tramcar 219 has to turn back and head for the smoke once more. This is a typical tram, as the older generation will remember them, dating from the mid-1930s. Recently, trams have made something of a comeback in Britain, and in the 1990s, Sheffield joined the list of towns with a metro system, Electric cars running partly on the streets, partly on former railway lines. They don't yet serve suburban runs like this, but have proved ideal on high-density routes. Playtime now, and the school children pour out onto the recreation ground. School uniform or no, there's not a pair of jeans or trainers in sight. The toy train is made to look like a steam engine, although it clearly isn't. It's a popular ride round the lake on a summer's day. All aboard! In the 1950s, every child knew what a real steam train looked like. Nowadays it's very different, but they still make fairground trains to look like steam engines. The other kind just aren't so much fun. Hold tight now. Now this is cheating. A train made up of a whole lot of cars. Still, the kiddies don't seem to mind. Threepence, please, love. Thank you. Steady getting in now. Hey, 2 steering wheels. There's something a bit more grown up for the boys. They'll be imagining they're the next Surtees, Brabham or Stirling Moss. Today's equivalent would probably be an expensive visit to a theme park, but this was just as much fun. Look at the traffic congestion on this boating lake. These little powerboats are great fun. They're really sturdy timber jobs, built to take no end of a battering. Mum's concentrating really hard. And a little paddle boat for junior drivers to practice on. Careful, don't drop that lolly. From the ridiculous to the sublime. For heading for port is the Queen Mary, jewel in the crown of Britain's fleet of liners, which in the post-war years was the biggest in the world. Launched in 1934, the 80,000-ton Queen Mary plied the Atlantic to New York until 1967, when she was retired and sailed to Long Beach, California. This is her smaller sister, the Mauretania, namesake of an older liner which once held the blue ribbon for crossing the Atlantic. By the mid-20th century, our ocean liners may have still ruled the waves, but their monopoly of global travel would end sooner than anyone realised. BOAC, the British Overseas Airways Corporation, would see to that. Hundreds of cars parked around new buildings at Heathrow point the way to the future. For the little ones, playtime is keeping up with the real thing. In the 1950s, commercial flying was really taking off. The Vickers Viking was a popular aircraft with British carriers. This, of course, was still the age of propeller aircraft. If you were a nervous flyer, seeing clouds of smoke from those engines as they started up wouldn't do your peace of mind any good. All aboard! The mighty Lockheed Constellation cruised at 300 miles an hour and 20,000 feet. In those first days of the new Elizabethan era, the sky seemed the limit. Today, in fact, we fly half as fast again and half as high again. We hope you've enjoyed this look at the way it was in Britain during the Coronation years. Now, half a century later, so much has changed in our everyday lives that these scenes from the 1950s look literally from another age. Bye for now.